problem. That sounds good.
Okay, now I'm going to let everyone in.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome, everyone in here and out there. So great to have all of you to this special reading tonight with Martha Collins, Nathan McClain, and Aaron Caycedo Kimura. We're really happy to see you here. We have a nice, cozy audience in the room, and we have a great audience on Zoom. Don't forget, everyone can see this recording when we put it up in a few weeks at the end of the season. So in case you missed something, you'll be able to go back and hear your favorite poems again. First of all, we want to quickly thank Arts Westchester and NISCA. Arts Westchester gave us a very generous Restart the Arts grant, and that has funded our reading series from the fall of 2021 through the end of 2022. So we're very grateful, and thank you to all the other foundations and individuals who support us. Thank you to the Slapping Hall Press Advisory Committee and editors. Thank you to the Board of Directors. We're so grateful to have all of you helping us. Thank you out there to all of the SHP people who are in the audience on Zoom and the people who are here supporting your SHP poet, Aaron, here tonight. We're really glad to have all of you. We have so many poets in the audience here in person. Thanks you all for being here. And don't forget, even the people on Zoom, to buy the wonderful collections. These books all just were published. Martha's was published on October 11th. Aaron, your date was the 4th, October 4th. And Nathan's, you were the 15th of September. That's the oldest one. So congratulations to all of you. And you know how hard it is right now during the pandemic to promote and to sell books. So please support these authors. We want to thank the Village Bookstore for being here today and selling the books. The authors will sign them afterwards. So we're very grateful to have all of you here. So without further ado, Aaron Caycedo Kimura is a writer and a visual artist. He is the author of 2 poetry collections, Ubasute, which won the 2020 Slapping Hall Press chapbook competition, and the full-length collection, Common Grace, which was just published by Beacon Press. His honors include a Robert Pinsky Global Fellowship in Poetry, a St. Botolph Club Foundation Emerging Artist Award in Literature, and nominations for the Pushcart Prize, the Best of the Net, and Best New Poets anthologies. His poems have been published widely in journals and literary magazines, and his paintings have appeared in galleries throughout Connecticut. Aaron earned his MFA in creative writing from Boston University. I will never forget the first time I read Aaron's manuscript that he submitted to the Slapping Hall Press chapbook contest. It was already fully realized, and it was such a wonderful work of art. It had such confidence and conviction. It was unlike anything I had ever read before, and I was not surprised that it was the collection that the co-editors unanimously chose to publish that year. It has been an honor working with Aaron and seeing his work blossom over the past couple of years. As Robert Pinsky writes, Caycedo Kimura brings a wry, tender, musical, and unsentimental attention to family love, sexual love, love of nature, and the underlying art of love. Please help me welcome Aaron Caycedo Kimura.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight to the reading, and thank you everyone online for tuning in. Thank you for that introduction, Jennifer. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm going to read 10 poems from my collection, Common Grace. This collection is divided into 3 sections, and so I'm going to just read a few poems from each of the sections. The first poem I'm going to read is the first poem in the book, and this will give you a little insight into my family background. It also might even date me a little. Family anthem. I walk into the garage from side door sunlight, ELO on my Walkman. My eyes dissolve the darkness, discover my parents locked in a slow dance embrace, whispering to each other like lovers. But my parents aren't lovers. They're Japanese. Never kiss, hold hands, say, I love you, not even to me. Once I asked Mom if she loved me, she replied, my mother and father never said it, but I knew they did. My parents hear my shuffle, separate like guilty teenagers. She escapes into the house, he into the Ford, opens the garage door. I fumble, forget what I was looking for, but all afternoon replay that dissonant chord. The next few poems I'm going to read are about my painting life. And these poems could also be read as Ars Poetica because they're very apropos to my poetry life as well. The next poem is entitled En Plein Air at Silver Sands State Park. En plein air, as many of you probably already know, is a term that means you take your portable easel out into the open and paint the landscape in front of you. En plein air at Silver Sands State Park. I block in the lights and darks of a cottonwood grove that looks like a moldy muffin floating on my canvas. The flies and wetland whiff of rotten egg will keep me from staying much longer. As I use the last dab of sap green on my palette, a woman walking a black lab stops to look. She tilts her head, nods. Do you remember Bob Ross? She loved his happy trees, how he made them so easy with the edge of his brush. She yanks her dog from sniffing my easel's leg. Come on, boy, leads me to my landscape. I end up staying all morning, struggling with my trees, trying to make art with each labored stroke. I don't go painting en plein air anymore because that's a guarantee that someone's going to stop you and talk to you about Bob Ross. Don't get me wrong, I love Bob Ross, but I'm such a huge introvert that I'd rather just be left alone. So I stay in the studio, and that's the title of the next poem I'm going to read. In the studio. Arranged on a table behind my easel, a red sake bottle, blue glass vase, an ochre bowl I bought for $1 at Goodwill. Joni Mitchell plays on my laptop. I slosh a number 5 flat brush in the wash container's cloudy turp, let it soak in the strainer, step away from the canvas 5 or 6 feet. Bowl's too flat. Some lighter touches in front will round it out. The background's kind of warm. A few strokes of blue-gray should cool it down, push it back. Joni sings California. After flying back to Santa Rosa when my father died, I returned home, met Tinica for coffee. She'd show my work if I didn't drip and spatter. For a while, I painted to please her, then canceled my show, let my brushes harden, my palette crust. Back at the easel, I grab a tube of ultramarine, squeeze a dab on my palette, slather in some vermilion, ochre, titanium white. Joni takes me back to junior high. I lose myself in study hall, scribbling and sketching all over the book covers, I made from brown paper bags. The next poem I'm going to read is a poem I wrote for another artist. When I went to BU to get my MFA, there was a project which they called the Writers Artists Book Project, where MFA poets and MFA art students were paired together to create a book. The poets would supply the text, and the artists would make a book. It could look like this. It could look like whatever they want. I saw shower curtains. I've seen etched glass. My artist was a landscape painter, so she painted this long piece of cardboard and then accordion folded it and then had my poem at the bottom, back and front. My artist took me into her studio, showed me her work, talked about her life. And from that, I wrote this sonnet, this blank verse sonnet for our project. And after writing this, I thought, okay, this is about her life, but it's so apropos to so many of us who desire to live an unconventional creative life. And this poem is entitled North on Route 101 for A.H. She drives up the winding coast, 20 miles per hour in Pacific fog, like she's searching for a line, a la prima, with the worn bristles of a flat brush. In every twist, she focuses on the road, not the drop-offs. The fog dissipates, swatches of wild rye, reed grass, and sky spread across the windshield. Back on the other coast, dishes, pots, pans, a job, most of her clothes. Tonight, she'll sleep near the foot of Mount St. Helens, wake up to a sun eruption of Hansa yellow and cadmium orange. She'll sketch a stream tumbling toward her over a fallen cedar, a sprinkling of pastel dust in her lap. I'm going to move on to the second section, which is about my parents. And it's good to transition to the second section because the train's going by. We worked that out. Okay. So my next poem is a pantoum, and it's entitled Burial. I returned my father's body to the earth, cremated as he instructed in a letter. No funeral, no obituary in the newspaper. Those who needed to know were told. I had his remains cremated as he instructed, scattered his ashes in Bodega Bay. Those who needed to know were told that I waited until my mother passed to scatter his ashes in Bodega Bay, past the jetty where we used to fish. I waited until my mother passed, poured out their dust together, past the jetty where we used to fish, from the deck of the Miss Anita, seagulls calling overhead. I poured out their dust together with a handful of Uncle George, from the deck of the Miss Anita, seagulls calling overhead. No funeral, no obituary in the newspaper. With a handful of Uncle George, I returned their bodies to the earth. My next poem is a poem about my parents when they first got married before my sister and I came along. And this poem is entitled The Hardest Part. The fire truck siren downstairs raided the air of my mother's dreams. She'd scream in her sleep, my father told me, even after we married. More than a decade past the Second World War, for him, American concentration camps, for her, the firebombing of Tokyo. They moved into a San Francisco apartment that rented to Japs, a one-bedroom walk-up above the Post Street fire station. They painted their bathroom black. It was in style then. Shelved books, unboxed a new rice cooker, watered a shrub of Japanese maple, potted for their future garden. When the station got a call in the middle of the night, the rumble of the overhead door crumbled into the wreck that was once her home. Swirling lights flashed ancient trees into flames through the thin silk curtains of her eyelids. No warning, no drill, no cover. My father stilled her body, his broad hand on her shoulder or hip as they lay in the dark, listening to the slowing of her breath. The hardest part of those nights, he said, was waiting, sometimes hours, for the truck and the men to come back. My mother was actually born here in the United States. She was born in Bayonne, New Jersey. And then before the war broke out, my grandfather took the family back to Japan. So she was there in Tokyo for the war. And then after the war, she came back to the United States and went to nursing school in New York City. And then she went back to Japan and worked at the Tokyo U.S. Army Hospital for a few years. And then she came back to the United States, this time to the West Coast, and that's where she stayed for the rest of her life. This poem is about my mother, and it's entitled Tokyo Army Hospital, 1957. She looks over her left shoulder, body slightly twisted toward the shutterbug, interrupting her conversation with the doctor. Nurse Hoshino, give us a smile. All in white, long-sleeved, high-collared uniform. Nurse's cap, like an inverted Dixie cup with a lacy brim. In a year, she'll return to the States, meet a guy named Joe on a tennis date, get married in 2, become a mother in 3, have me in 6. 60 years later, I'll find the photo in my basement in a box, rummaging through her stuff I can't throw away. I'll post it on the internet. Happy Mother's Day. She's 29, half my age. I want to go back in time, tell her something wise, or at least helpful. But having lived through a world war, she already knows more than I do. Those of you who follow me on social media will know that yesterday I posted that photograph on on all my feeds. So if you're interested in what that photograph looks like, come follow me. I'm going to move to the last section. I have 3 more poems I'd like to read for you. This next poem is a haibun, and many of you already know because there are so many poets here that haibun is a Japanese form that's basically a prose poem undergirded with a haiku. I wrote this poem maybe 2014, 15, before the current attack on the Ukraine. And this poem is the title poem called Common Grace. In the rush of autumn wind, a student reads Chaucer on the banks of the Charles. Her morning desk, a sunlit bench with notebooks, blue water bottle, a Ziploc bag of wheat thins. An old woman with a metal cane limps to the bench, scrunching amber leaves underfoot. She liberates a surge of Ukrainian as if she's never left her country, family, friends, war zones. The student collects her things to one side, stretches a tiny smile, no eye contact, returns to 95 pages due tomorrow. The woman continues her Slavic monologue, pulling a gray sweater from her canvas bag. Surrendering to the disruption, now an armhole struggle, the student helps the woman with gentle tugging and smoothing. An accented thank you, a closed book on the bench. They exhale with the wind and watch a crew team glide across the water. Sweeping oars, geese float in formation across cyan sky. I read that one a little too slowly because I ran into the train there. He did his job. I didn't do mine. Two more poems I'd like to share with you. This next poem I wrote after thinking about what would it be like if I knew that today was the last day I was going to be alive. If this was the last day I was going to spend on earth alive. And this is the poem I wrote thinking about that. This poem is not really about dying, but it's about contentment. And it's entitled, If This Were the Day. If this were the day, I'd still shower, shave, eat breakfast for the pleasure, a toasted bagel, a schmear, lox, red onion, capers, definitely capers, an iced mocha. I'd skip the stretching, crunches, push-ups, go right to the garden, check the milkweed for monarchs, the yarrow planted yesterday. Back in the house, straighten out my studio, just a little, open my laptop, start a poem, a few lines for drama. After emailing you my passwords, go lie on the sofa, text you a heart, rest the phone on my chest. I'd listen to you stop singing slightly out of tune in the kitchen. Wait for the vibration of your answer, drift. And my last poem, thank you, Jennifer, at the Hudson Valley Writers Center for having me tonight. Thank you, everyone, for coming out for this reading. Thank you, everyone online, for tuning in. My last poem is entitled Gutter Trees. Louisa and I raised the ladder, walking it up, rung by rung, prop it against the second story. After a breath, balance it back, heave the extension by hand, 4 hands to be exact. Rung locks click into place with each push. The rope and pulley don't work. In seasons of dirt and leaves mulched into the gutter, pigweeds have grown, or maybe hickory seedlings standing a foot or so above the roof's edge. Before moving here, we were blown across 2 countries, 3 states, 6 cities, dug in wherever we landed. If it weren't for the neighbors, we'd let our gutter trees linger, our hanging garden of Bloomfield, 9th wonder of the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aaron. That was wonderful. Don't forget to buy Common Grace right over here, Village Bookstore. It's so nice to finally meet you in person after all this time, Aaron. That was a wonderful reading. Nathan, my pressmate. Nathan McClain is the author of Scale from Four-Way Books 2017 and his new collection, Previously Owned, which was just published by Four-Way Books in September 2022. A recipient of fellowships from the Frost Place Sewanee Writers Conference, Breadloaf Writers Conference, and a graduate of the MFA program for writers at Warren Wilson. A Cave Canem Fellow, his poems and prose have recently appeared or are forthcoming in Poetry Northwest, Green Mountains Review, On the Seawall, among others. He teaches at Hampshire College and serves as poetry editor for the Massachusetts Review. I have been following Nathan's work since his first collection was published in 2017. His reading here with Chen Chen was one of my favorite celebrations of debut collections I have hosted. Like our pressmate John Murillo, who blurbed Previously Owned, Nathan possesses an extraordinary talent for narrative poems. Whether he turns his insightful eye to a Roman statue of a boy about to pull a thorn from his foot, or the speaker thinking about painful moments from his childhood, Nathan's empathy, imagery, and language make us feel like we understand what is at stake. Diane Seuss writes, a speaker of nuanced intelligence and lush interiority reflects on the American landscape, its pastoral and judicial and historical duplicity, entwined with racial alienation and violence. In the book's first poem, the speaker asks himself, and what have you learned from standing here so long, examining pain? The answer is the powerful poems of this collection, for which we're all grateful. Please help me welcome Nathan McClain.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that really beautiful and moving introduction. Thank you to everyone who is joining us from the internet, and thank you to all of you for being here. It's a real honor to be reading alongside Aaron and Martha. Martha, certainly, whose work I've long been a fan of, and Aaron, whose work I am newly very, very grateful for and a fan of. I'm largely going to read from this new collection. And once again, so much gratitude to Hudson Valley and certainly to Jennifer for not only inviting me to this reading and certainly the reading that I was invited to with Chen Chen, but for really embracing me as part of the HVWC family. I've been able to teach a number of workshops and classes here, and I've been just really grateful for Jennifer allowing that space and platform. So thank you so much. I'm going to start this evening with a poem entitled The World is Full. I can find it. I saw the wolf outside the window, in the backyard, nearly near the park bench, nearly stripped of all its paint. Or I thought it was a wolf I saw, insomuch as I even called, wolf, wolf, through every room of the house. It was quite the spectacle. False alarm, one might say, in these cases, as if explanation were a kind of comfort. I was not comforted. My panic startled me, the way one can be startled by something he's read in a book he's forgotten he owns, that he can't in the slightest remember buying while thumbing over the other spines, all those titles huddled together there on the shelves. Out of nowhere, we say in these cases. Where did this come from? How had I missed this? The wolf seemed to come out of nowhere, Or maybe from a book I remember read to me as a child, some cautionary tale, a window capable of being looked in, seen through, if you were brave. It was not a wolf outside the window. It was a coyote, but with a wolf's bulk, its metallic flash of fur, its appetite. I admit, I was afraid, not for myself, but for the chickens. I looked out the window because the chickens clucked so madly, like children at a school running amok. The hens flapped at the glass. The chicks instinctively slipped out of sight into the taller, wet grass. No, it was not a wolf. Of course, I knew the difference. I had been a boy, been small enough to be clenched in a wolf's jaw, though I never was. I was safe. I wanted to save them, but the commercial in the background insisted that the window for savings was closing fast, then faded to black, as they do when they're done. The wolf scattered them the way feathers can be scattered, torn from the body, or the way children are drilled even in grade school to scatter. Shh. We prepared for this now. I called wolf. I clapped at the glass, which I've been told makes a difference, and I wanted things to be different. To the chickens, it must have looked as if I took delight in their predicament. And who would tell them otherwise? The world is full of suffering. It's true. Why not delight in that it's yours, not mine, for once? The coyote slunk away, or the wolf did, something dead, I thought, between its teeth. I was afraid, though I went out to look for what was missing. 10 chickens, 2 chicks. I counted them, the way I tally all loss, scattered the way one might scatter birdseed in the yard, or how one might scatter a child's ashes to the ocean's indifference. I had been a boy, lost among the woods as in some fable, or maybe not lost, just the shade of tree bark. Not a wolf, though to the chickens, the distinction hardly matters. Here, Chicky Chicky. No one had bothered to name them. To name them, we believed, would make them harder to kill and eat. But how wrong we were. I believed I could save them, or that saving them meant I loved them, that my love was good for something. At the center of this collection is really a lot of thinking about criminal justice, and there is a sequence in this book in the middle section, all with the same title, entitled "They Said I Was an Alternate," in which I'm really sort of grappling with being selected as an alternate juror in a case, attempted murder case in New York City back in 2018. So I'll navigate a few of those poems. They said I was an alternate, said the case was in the bag. He was black. There was a gun, a no-brainer. He was black, they said. Doesn't it add up? If you think of our children, open and shut, they said, or gun plus black equals him. They said, no question. Do the math, dummy. They said, think. They said, oh, never mind. Said the case was in the bag, open and shut, they said. He was black, there was a gun, or gun plus black equals him. A no-brainer, they said. He was black. They said, do the math, dummy. Doesn't it all add up? If you think, they said, think of our children. Our children, they said. Oh, Never mind. The flowers. The flowers in the greenhouse, now flowers in the supermarket, rubber bound, clipped from wherever they seemed almost to nod their agreement with what the breeze once said. Now flowers in some glass vase on the dining room table where no one eats. What race they are doesn't matter, nor if their stems are thorny, you see. They're just flowers. They die. You walk by them all the time, hardly thinking twice about their names. They said I was an alternate, so I sought to perfect silence, as was expected of me. I nodded in the lobby, said nothing with my breakfast interrogated on the conveyor belt. Then the elevator sealed me like an envelope. At dinner, my partner poured the bottle of wine I pointed to, which also helped. Pulling open the can of wet food was conversation enough for the cat. If I could tell her, my mother might be most impressed. So all that practice finally paid off, huh? How like a god, they will say of it, useless and everlasting. They said I was an alternate, but before that, what do you like to do with your free time? And one of us said, long walks with her dog around the park. And another said, kick it with the homies on the block. And I might have said, cook or write or something dumb like that, though the judge didn't judge. And another juror would only answer in private. And one said he liked to read a good book, though what one considers good is arguable. And sure, the question seemed odd, but it took our minds off the past a while, which we all had to answer for or to. One said, take a warm bath. One whispered, are we ever going home? And this is for particularly for all the nerds out there. Hopefully there are some nerds in Zoomland who are attending this evening. Oh, now I'm catching the train. There we go. Yeah. Wonderful. I like that. It makes the place feel so atmospheric. They said I was an alternate, but that's all behind me now. Today, I'm around the table with friends, finally Dungeons and Dragons night, building a character for a campaign that will likely kill me. I hardly talk about the old days anymore. The DM asks my name, my backstory, my flaw, which I have left to either fate or chance. What's the difference? In the end, what damage there is largely psychic, is all in the mind, which is not to say imaginary, even in role play. And I, for one, play by the book. I roll the dice. I take what I get. At the park, a boy's birthday party. No surprises here, really. not the plastic white cutlery or the fancy glass bowl, cubes of pineapple embossed pear floating in punch, naturally red, that no one, thank the Lord, has thought yet to spike. Each boy, blindfolded, spun in place and shoved down the piñata's path with a bat he can barely lift, the piñata, star-shaped, tasseled pink at its ends. Seems accurate. At this age, their limbs inarticulate as the smoke of catfish or pork ribs that hiss on the park grill. They hardly notice the sun's descent. It's getting late, I think, to say, as someone's father knots the blindfold over my eyes, fits the bat into my hands. In my ear, the boys shriek, and there, the star, snagged in the oak of my mind, the rope swaying almost gently. How, even dizzied, do I step towards it? This poem is entitled What You Call It, and certainly has some. I live in Massachusetts now. I've lived there on and off, seemingly for the last 4 years, and now I'm there at least in a more permanent basis. Like we finally like bought a house and got a dog, all that sort of thing that you do when you're adulting a bit more. But this was from some of my early days of being there and figuring out what the Northeast was like. It's mostly like hammocks in random places and lots of farmers markets, that sort of thing. So that's what this deals with. What you call it. Not my usual route to the market, past the railroad tracks, then past Grace Episcopal Church, its courtyard empty. No men clasping hands as though agreeing finally to the difficult terms of some treaty. So I would not have known it was a peach tree unless the person who planted it or someone on the street told me. Which is not to say its fruit didn't look peach-like. It did. Rather, I didn't read it as such, didn't know what I was seeing really. From where I stood, the fruit young and perfect and heavy, at least heavy enough to bow the branches, though hardly ready yet to eat. Ripe, one might say, which, true, is more precise, precision, a thing of value. Not that the fruit cares what you call it, or stands for anything other than what time can make of some small human intervention, is no piece of literature. The peach was simply a peach, and there, for the taking, which is often said of an object that has gone unwatched for too long, susceptible to trespass, which happened first in the mind and happened first because of fruit, or so says the good book if you believe in such things. Knowledge, which a poet once called historical, too, a trespassing of sorts, the proof of which perhaps best shown in how one might punish a slave who had been taught to read the word beauty or toil or rest secretly and by firelight. There are things nearly impossible to forget, having so trespassed, having badly needed to see up close this tree, its fruit dangling there within reach, though not the same as being offered. Tenderness, I have learned, is only one test of whether some fruit has truly ripened. You press the flesh right here. But for me, that would mean crossing half the yard, the way a paper boat might be pushed by wind across a pond. And just two more poems for you this evening, because Jennifer so beautifully talked about the this next poem in her introduction, and because the brilliant Diane Seuss certainly talked about it, I feel I would be remiss if I didn't read it. This is Boy, and it's the poem that opens the collection. This is Boy pulling a thorn from his foot. Small enough to cradle, caught in the act of concentration, you see it chiseled there, his bronze body curled into a question mark, not pulling, rather about to pull the thorn finally out. Nothing original here, nothing new. Marble, quartz, the old masters have for ages now sculpted this scene. You've seen it, and here you are looking. Again, the little boy. Again, his insistent grief. So what? Some exhibits in the museum have already gone dark. So what? Others have moved on to new rooms, left you comfortless with your notepad and pen. And what have you learned from standing here so long, examining pain, no matter how ancient? What good has it done you? The thorn, thrumming still. He almost has it now. So close. Step back, the guard warns. His one job, to enforce the distance necessary, which might be called perspective, though not yet. And finally, I'm going to close with a poem entitled "Now That I Live in This Part of the Country," and I'm just incredibly grateful to be able to share some of this work and alongside these wonderful poets, and also just truly grateful for Hudson Valley Writing Center and the myriad of ways that this organization has welcomed me and my work. And so just yet another reason to be grateful. And thank you to all of you, and to all of you for your time and attention. Now that I live in this part of the country, the fireflies are far more abundant. A word I thought I'd never use again. And someone says, "How beautiful," which I could forgive. And someone says, "Look, they flash the way hazard lights sometimes flash." And I might have said, "No, don't they seem to pulse with the glow of old grievances?" But then no one really asked me. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Nathan. That was such a wonderful reading. And all of these poets here tonight, you will notice, read their works so well, which we can maybe talk about during the Q&A. Okay. Martha Collins' 11th book of poetry, Casualty Reports, was just published in the Pitt Poetry Series on October 11th. Her previous book, Because What Else Could I Do, was also published by Pitt in 2019, and it won the Poetry Society of America's William Carlos Williams Award. Blue Front from Grey Wolf, a book-length poem, is based on a lynching that Martha's father witnessed as a child. It won the Ansfield Wolf Book Award and was chosen as one of the 25 books to remember from 2006 by the New York Public Library. Some of her other awards include fellowships from the NEA, the Bunting Institute, the Ingram Merrill Foundation, and the Witterbiner Foundation. An active translator, she has also published 4 volumes of co-translations from the Vietnamese and co-edited with Kevin Proofer into English poems, translations, commentaries from Grey Wolf in 2017. Born in Nebraska and raised in Iowa, she was educated at Stanford University and the University of Iowa. She founded the creative writing program at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and for 10 years served as Pauline Delaney Professor of Creative Writing at Oberlin. She lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Martha Collins is one of the most important voices writing in America today, and boy, does America need her. As 201 years ago, as Shelley wrote 201 years ago, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Since then, it has become more and more clear that many poets and writers feel a moral and ethical obligation to not only hold a mirror up to the ills and evils of society, but to try through their words to change them. To call Martha Collins a political poet would be a narrow and reductive description of her poetics. She is both a poet of people and of the population. She is achingly intimate and expansively universal in both her topics and her craft. She is equally at home writing about injustices her father witnessed as a coal miner and reporting on what it's like to watch a beloved friend dying. In a 2012 interview with Michael Sims for Coal Hill Review, Collins stated, "I've learned that I have to push past a whole army of mental censors that tell me I cannot, should not, must not write what I'm writing, whether for aesthetic or moral or some other reasons. It took me a while, but I finally learned that I'm usually onto something when I hear the censor's voice." In a 2006 New York Times book review of Blue Front, Dana Goodyear observes that Collins, quote, suppresses punctuation and traffics in fragmentary non sequiturs. Her shift in perspectives are abrupt. Therefore, nothing about the narrative is straight. Her discursive, breathless, self-contradicting, breaking off and circling back technique makes the book feel like the testimony of a traumatized witness, which of course it is. In his recent review of Casualty Reports, Charles Rammelkamp writes, Collins does for coal mining what Herman Melville did for whaling in Moby Dick, an exhaustive overview and close examination of its history and its global implications. In my favorite poem of the collection, Martha's stunning poem, Like Her Body, The World, conflates a woman suffering domestic violence with the earth being destroyed by human greed and hubris. Like many of Martha's poems, this piece uses inventive and experimental language without ever diluting its profound meaning. She writes, "We thought we would never fall, but we are falling, falling and hitting the air, falling, hitting ourselves, our own body. Meanwhile, the body, the world try to get up, or else the body, the world will lie down." Casualty Reports is a book that no one can afford not to read. Please help me welcome Martha Collins.
Thank you, Jennifer. I hope I can live up to that. And thank you, Jennifer, for inviting me. Thank you, Hudson Valley Writers Center. Thank you, Village Books. And thank you all for being here and out there. And especially thank you, Aaron and Nathan, for those wonderful readings. Casualty Reports. There are many kinds of casualties and losses in this book. I'll begin with this one. again later. The person you are trying is not accepting, is not at this time. Please again. The person you are trying is not in service. Please check that you have. This is your call. Your person is not accepting. Your person is this number. You have not correctly. Your person is a recording. Again later at this time. And for Jennifer, like her body, the world. Hit and hit and hit and hit and fallen. Getting up and trying to get up. Now one part is hitting another part, wounding its flesh, slicing its own veins, breaking its bones. But wait, we are coming. Help is on the way. Now we are hitting the part that is hitting the part. Now it is arm against arm, hand against hand. Now it is eye against eye, no one can see. Now it is ear against ear, there is no mouth. Where is the up to get up to? Where is the body? Where are the parts? Have the parts all fallen apart? We are part of the body we forgot. We thought we lived outside like a brain in a jar. We thought we were pure like thought with nothing to lose. But we are losing too. We are losing parts. Besides, we were never that brain. We were only a part. We thought we would never fall, but we are falling. Falling and falling and falling, hitting the air. Falling, hitting ourself, our own body. Meanwhile, the world will try to get up, or else the body, the world, will lie down. This next poem was written some time ago, but I'm going to read it with Ukraine in mind. For Gaza. For the woman who cooks on a fire of sticks and boards beside her shell of a house, her bag of clothes on a tree. For physician Ani al-Jarrah, his wife cut in half, his year-old son turned to pieces. For the 30 dead Samuni family members dug out of the rubble, for the living, including children who clutched dead mothers. For the schools and mosques and homes destroyed by bombs, for the graves disturbed by tanks. For the more than 1,300 dead, including those who walked from their homes as directed with white flags. For those going home to water their trees, lemon and almond and olive, and for those trees. Hearing the train when you're reading about tanks is a little. Two of the sections of this book are about coal, and I'll read a few from the first of those sections here. In Illinois, my father's father had a share in the Enterprise mine, the Enterprise Coal and Coke Company, 1871. He was a shareholder, being a coal digger, kept a log of entries, shafts and air shafts, rooms by number and number of feet, died 1881. My father's father went down to a river town to work, came back to the mining town where his father went down in the Paradise mine, a miner and later a mine examiner, tested the air, the face, and the roof, Sundays and holidays too, walked 3 miles out and back when there was no train. My father, whose mother kept him out of the mines, kept his father's oil lamp, kept his father's carbide and safety lamps, kept a box of Wicks Picks globes, kept his father's 50-year union pin, his first aid pin, his flashlight, safe for use, kept manuals, papers. This lamp was given, all labeled, this pin was given, kept it all. It was his legacy, labeled, dated 1965, and signed and kept for me. Movie. When I was 10, they took me into a coal mine. I gave a report to our class that had seen How Green Was My Valley, a movie set in Wales. The miners had lamps like my grandfather's lamps, and I never forgot the whistle, explosion, the father trapped and killed, but I had forgotten the wage cuts, the strike, the lost jobs, the emigration to countries like our own. We're still in Illinois, DuQuoin. In my family's town, which was also Ruby Goodman's town, there were accidents, there were explosions, there were strikes. But although the miners armed themselves at least once against rumored strikebreakers, the union, which met in houses before it joined the UMWA, succeeded without violence and became one of the largest locals with over 1,000 members, including Ruby's Black father, for a time the union president. You have to join the union, he said. Everyone does. Every man has the same voice, white, black, gray, no big eyes, no little U's. And this next poem takes its title and much of its content from a book written in 1949 by Margaret Wise Brown, whom I'm sure some of you know as the author of Goodnight Moon. This is not Goodnight Moon. Two little miners. Two little miners standing on the little golden book cover. One white and one black. They smile at each other. Like the Integrated Miners Union. Oh, but look inside. They wake up clean as snow, but by night they've turned black. Black as soot, night a crow, black as black, coal black. Back home, they live alone, but someone's fixed their supper. Two little miners, black as night, scrub in your tub until you're white. I'll return to coal in a minute, but first I'd like to read a poem that has a little history. The poet Jake Adam York was from the South, made a project. He intended to finally visit all of the sites where victims of the civil rights era and movement had been killed. He unfortunately died at the age of 39, and the also late poet John Tribble invited poets all around the country to take over and write their own poems. So I visited Philadelphia, Mississippi, where you may recall the 3 civil rights workers, Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, were held in prison before they were killed. There's another familiar name from that era in this poem also. Rehearsal, Philadelphia, Mississippi, Luther Jackson, 1932 to 1959. A block from the county courthouse with the Confederate Soldier Memorial, past the jail where the civil rights workers were held while the Klan assembled in '64, down Bird to Oak to water, to pine, past magnolias, into sweet gum, catalpa, into this dead-end cave of trees where he parked one night with a girl and passed out, and Officer Rainey found them and ordered him out of the car and pushed him out of sight of the girl, who heard 2 shots and heard Rainey say, "Come down, I think I have killed a..." And then the coroner's jury said justifiable homicide, and Medgar Evers requested an investigation, but the Justice Department said no violation. And 5 years later, they accused Rainey and 20 others of conspiring to kill the civil rights workers. But 3 years later, Rainey himself was acquitted. And 50 years later, the FBI reopened the Jackson case, but found no police, no county records, just newspaper files and relative stories. And anyway, Rainey was dead. Of course, I couldn't have been that girl, but if I'd been the white girl I was and lived here and read the papers, would I have questioned justifiable? And if I'd been here 5 years later and read about the civil rights workers, and decades later when Michael, Eric, Tamir, Philando, and all the others, can I imagine myself in that car at the end of this dead-end street where a man was ordered out of the car and the girl who was with him, who was not me, cried, "You have killed him for nothing." And now I'll return to coal and end with several of these. We go back to the prehistory of coal and up to the present. Grave. It is all over the earth, under earth, a graveyard. Tree ferns, trees, roots, bark, seeds, ancient life that emerged from the sea, forests flooded to swamps and bogs, transformed to peat, transformed again, sunk, covered with layers of earth, with strange amphibian, snake, and later dinosaur bones. Layers and layers, and under it all for hundreds of millions of years, our ancestors resting under earth, overburdened, we say, until we found them. And the revolution we call the coal to power steam engines, to pump water and lift coal, to sell or use to power steam. Coal to coke for furnaces, to smelt iron, to make tools, and furnaces to smelt for rails. Trains to transport coal, to power steam engines, to power trains, and boats to transport coal. Harness the power of, raised to the power of power. And this next poem also takes its title from a children's book, or rather a series of children's books. The machine that it describes lives in Germany, and the poem refers to the website of the machine as well as the children's book. Now that's big. Then they made the largest machine, the heaviest in the world. It's as long as 2.5 football fields. It weighs 13,000 tons, has 18 buckets to excavate the overburden that covers the coal. It could fill 10,000 dump trucks per day, as much as 40,000 workers could. It's continuous, never stops. It's still uncovering 40 million tons each year to power electric stations that power much of its country, including itself. It won't stop till 2050, when all the coal in the mine where it works will be exhausted. Whose lungs were lost to coal dust, black coal to black lung, now rock dust to lungs. Whose jobs were lost to strip mines, to mining machines, to natural gas, or paid less because. Who sold mineral rights to land when farming replaced jobs, whose farms subsided, were lost. Two more. Burning. The mercury, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides from burning coal that fill our air and fall upon us as acid rain. The selenium, arsenic, lead from coal ash stored in coal ash ponds that leak and spill and pollute our waters. But most of all, the carbon dioxide released by burning that captures heat, that warms our air and melts our glaciers, lifts our seas and warms them, dries our land and fuels fires, strengthens rainfalls and hurricanes that swell our waters and generate floods, all of which threaten our coasts and cities, our islands and whole nations, consume our animals, plants, insects and fish, whole species, including most likely our own, unless. And the last poem, and thank you again, everyone, for being here. Blessing. Where we dug up the graves of Black slaves who mined the first coal in Illinois, where we desecrated the graves of indigenous people that covered coal in the Southwest, where we dug up animals, plants in their graves and burned them as oil and gas and coal. There and throughout our earth, let us grieve for the graves we robbed, and then let us bless the graves of the dead that remain, and over them for the living, the wind, the sun. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martha. That was really powerful. Thank you all for being here. We are going to invite the poets up to do a brief Q&A for all of you in the room, and Sophia will text me questions from the Zoom audience, and then we will sign books. Think of your other questions and we'll have it.
There's the other question. You tell me. I'd love to hear from you, Aaron, especially since this is your I know you did the chapbook, but then this is the first full length, and I don't know how much of the chapbook was in the full length as well. Or
The middle section of the book is an expanded version of the chapbook. Yeah. I think the first thing that comes to mind is that very few of us could do this alone. Yeah, I think it's essential to get another set of eyes on your manuscript, and if possible, a few set of eyes. It's so essential to have trusted friends who are not only good poets, but people who read your work well, people who understand what it is that you're trying to do. So I think that that's one very important thing, is not to go at it alone, but to get help.
Yeah.
And because we're very, very rarely are we good readers of our own work. You know, we don't always see things as they really are.
Yeah. Yeah. I would certainly say in my own experience, that I've, especially after Scale was published, and I was convinced that I would only be writing like father poems for the rest of my life. And I'm sure I absolutely could. I very much could. And so when other things started coming, I was really excited, but I also kind of had to like discipline myself and trick myself into not automatically like trying to figure out where this new poem was going to fit into a book, largely because it just like it pulls you it pulls you right out of like the moment of being with the individual poem, and you're already sort of like thinking about this larger project. Maybe it fits nowhere, maybe it's not part of something, maybe it's just a poem that's practice for you getting to the poems that are, that will comprise a book. And so I've been grateful for, I think, the quality that I think it accompanies many poets and writers, which is obsession. And that even though I don't know all of the things that my subconscious and my mind is really working out on the page, I tell my students all the time that our poems are so much smarter than we are. We're so often just playing catch up to them and figuring out something that your subconscious has already worked through. So yeah, typically for me, I tend to write until I have like a stack of work and I'm like, oh man, where did this come from? And then I start to try to figure out, are these talking to each other at all? Is anything happening here? And sometimes you get lucky and it does.
This is the first book that I published for some time that hasn't in some sense been a book length poem. It's much more various and yet not terribly various. So I guess I am so obsessive that once I get going on something, I can't stop, So I wrote a poem all those years ago about this lynching my father had witnessed. And then I sort of, that wasn't done and I wasn't done. And then at some point I thought, well, I can't put any other poems in this book. But the other thing that happened to me in writing that book, and I'm referring now to the interview that Jennifer cited, I really discovered, maybe before that, but especially then, that there are all these censors that say, you can't do that. You can't write that poem. You can't write a poem about lynching. That's not good. And so now I always pay attention and I consider that the censors in my head, who are my teachers, my parents, my society, they're my muses, the ones who say you can't do that. And in that stage of writing, I am alone with myself. And one of the things I say to myself is nobody has to see these poems except me.
Yeah.
So that's stage one. Stage two is exactly the stage you mentioned, which is incredibly important. I think it's important to have readers, which, if you write for a while, you figure out who your best readers are, the ones you can really trust. And maybe we would eventually figure out some things that those other people could tell us, but it would take us a long time. You say, oh, why didn't I think of that?
I have a follow-up question to what Mark was talking about with the census. How do you each of you write about those things that are most difficult for you to contend with, whether it's things that you in your personal life or things going on in society that you witness that you feel are wrong? How do you grapple with those topics on the page?
Yeah, this book in particular is very much an interesting experience for me, in large part because this was one of the times in which I've written poems that were, at least to my mind, seemingly like overtly political, and I sort of made this kind of challenge to myself, is that I didn't want to really ever write poems that were overtly political, but all poetry writing is political. But I had made that sort of decision for myself largely because I felt that as a Black male poet and writer that was somewhat expected of me, was to be angry, was to be contentious, was to be loud, was to be combative. And so I wanted to resist sort of like leaning into any sort of expectations that there were of me. But these were, of course, the poems that kept coming up in my own sort of like lived and learned experiences. And you can only sort of ignore, I think, that kind of thing so for so long. And that sort of willingness to sort of like be vulnerable with oneself on the page. I've been surprised at so many junctures of not only writing this book, but also writing Scale, which sort of revealed so many things about me that I didn't know that I was willing to admit to myself even. I like to think of what I do in poems as sort of like, as I say it like this, that if thinking is what human beings do with experience, then that of course encapsulates feeling for me as well. And the way that I navigate through a poem is really me trying to figure out how I think or feel about it. And oftentimes it means that I have to sort of like write it out. But like Martha said, like there is that difference between sort of like writing the thing and deciding to share the thing. Like I can put it away and decide this is not for anyone but me. Maybe this is too rage-filled for anyone but me. So yeah, that's at least in my own work how I've navigated that.
I still consider myself a really young writer. So everything that I've written has been things that I've wanted to write about and that I've been drawn to. I haven't really addressed those things that I would consider difficult. So I would say the way that I deal with it is I'm just letting time pass and tell me when it's time to write those things. And I know that it'll come, you know. I'm not going to push it. I'm going to let it just happen.
Yeah, I have written so much about difficult things. The question is, how do I write a happy poem? Somebody can give me some advice. I'm actually a very happy person. Things happen. Poems come to you. I mean, the lynching came to me when I discovered my father had witnessed a lynching when he was 5 years old. It changed my life, and my life keeps getting changed. Other things come my way. All of the poems that I've written about larger, difficult things come in some way out of family. I had a personal tragedy some years ago. I wrote a whole book about that when my husband died. I mean, I don't have to look for the difficult. It comes calling. So the real question is, how do I write about it? Not whether, and not how do I get to it? And for me, one of the things I had to figure out in way back in writing about the lynching, I couldn't just tell about it. I couldn't just write down, this is what happened. And so I had to find strategies for doing that. And I keep finding strategies. And until I do, the thing haunts me. The difficult thing becomes the rock in my path. I try to write around it. I can't, but I haven't figured out how to write it. So the how, I can't tell you how I get to the how, but I can tell you how I've done it sometimes, but that's the real question for me.
That's probably like I mean, we all sort of think about like how much craft goes into the writing and revising and sort of like just sitting and interrogating one's work. But, there is also that element of kind of like magic or luck that I think accompanies that as well. So like, when you finally figure out that how to write into it, when the strategy, after you've tried so many other things and the strategy finally comes to you.
Right. Or I've tried them usually in my head. I mean, there's just a whole lot of rejection for me and just things rattle around for a long time in there.
I think that's what makes poetry such an amazing art. Just trying to figure out the best or most artistic way to present that thing.
I think you might have just answered the question I had percolating, and the answer is intuition. But the through line that I saw through all three of you are these moments of historical reclamation. I was wondering about how you would approach that, like what are your entry points? What are your angles of approach? How do you made history, all of you made history seem so present and so relevant to the present. How do you do that? You might have just said intuition, and it might be
My entry point is always through what my parents told me. That's the first thing. What I remember as a little boy, my father saying this, my mother saying this. And then I take that as an adult and say, okay, well, what does that mean for me? Does it mean for everybody else? And how to present that? I don't know.
That the entry point for me is always personal, and it has been family in many books. My grandparents went to the World's Fair in 1904, and then I found out how horribly racist that fair was. My father witnessed a lynching. My grandfather and great grandfather were coal miners. So the starting point is personal, and if it weren't, I don't know that I would write about these things. I just don't know that I would, even though I'm not necessarily in it all myself. And then I do a whole lot of research. And I love the research. It's Toni Morrison, who reads her own books. I listened to her read A Mercy, and there was a little interview afterwards, and the interviewer said, oh, it must be really difficult to do all that research you've done. This is a book about colonial America, many different kinds of people in it. She said, oh no, she said, I love the research. At some point I have to tell myself to stop doing the research and get writing. And so I have.
Yeah. And I think for me, I definitely think, as you were mentioning, intuition is definitely one part of it for sure. But I know that my own personal sort of approach to poems is that there are often these, there's often 2 or 3 kinds of like different sort of like threads that are coming together for me. That I'm typically trying to figure out. So I'll usually have maybe like one piece of it, and then after I've sort of like jotted down maybe some lines or some things are in my head, then I have to sort of sit with it and wonder, like, what are you doing here? I also talk to my students about the one time that I set out to try to write. I was like, I want to write a sexy poem. Like I was like, I've never written like a truly sexy poem, and I just want to write one, and I'm just gonna do it. And so I start out, just really playing around with language and sound and some of the sonic texture. And then my mother shows up in the poem.
Whoops.
What are you doing here? My mother's entrance into the poem ends up making it, aside from being something that's maybe very pleasing from a textural and sonic perspective, it ends up giving it a bit more weight and emotive charge. And so trusting some of those interweavings as well. And I think largely I've been really happy with this, at least with this recent book, with sort of giving myself permission to kind of like take up a bit more space. Scale had a lot of poems that were much shorter, and so I envy someone like Martha, who's writing book length poems. I was like, I can't do that, but I was really appreciative of being able to give myself permission to sort of feel out where some of the work is going, and trusting some of the turns that poems surprise you with.
Yeah. Nice.
People read so well. Do you have ways that you practice reading, or I don't know if it's relating perhaps to how you work as you're writing the poems?
I think personally for me, anytime I'm laying a poem out on the page, I'm hoping that it at least sort of like has a semblance of sounding like not only sounding like, but being paced like my kind of like human speaking voice.
Mhm.
But I also, at least for me, one of the things that I have, and maybe this is just from like writing for a long time and getting older. One of the things that I've given myself permission to do, especially when I'm giving readings, is to really just take my time
Mhm.
with the work.
Mhm.
And when I was younger and a younger writer, and I was invited to a reading because I felt like this might be the last reading that I ever get to I'm gonna squeeze all into this 10 minutes. And really, you don't really get a chance to sort of luxuriate in the work, and neither do the audience members. So that's largely been my approach, is like really taking my time, and that might mean that I only read 4 poems in a setting, but I'm okay with that. Like, I think I will know that I will feel, at least though, that the time that we spend in those poems will be really meaningful.
I come from a musical background.
Mm.
I have relatives, one of whom may be up there on Zoom, who are very musical. And I'm very grateful for that background, but clearly I was not destined to play the violin. But music is in my head. And when I'm writing a poem, the music is in my head. I'm hearing it all the time. I am so intent on sound. Sometimes when I'm teaching a class, a workshop, we will read the poem and my students will know what it's about, and I'll just be listening to the music, you know. So it comes with the territory of writing a poem for me. And by the time I get up to read it, it's in my head. I've read it out loud to myself in the process of writing as well as practicing.
One of the things that impressed me about both your work is that it's so musical, you know, that came out to me. I used to be a musician,
And
And
painter,
yeah, well, no, this is a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. I used to be a musician. I did my first round of education in music. Didn't want to be a performer, so that's why I left that. But that's still in me, and so when I'm writing, I am constantly reading it back to myself out loud to see how it tastes and how it sounds. But I recognize that so strongly in your work, and and the way you read too. It's incredible. But to answer your question, I'm reading it out loud as I'm writing. And when I'm reading at a reading, I think I'm trying to emulate Robert Pinsky. Because the first time I heard Robert Pinsky read, the heavens opened up and I thought, oh my gosh, you know, and he's very musical. You know, he considers himself, he said one time, a horn player in the band, you know, but you know, I can hear that. And so I don't read like Robert Pinsky. I wish I did. But you know, I'm trying to do the things that he does.
And I think it helps edit too, right? You reading aloud. I think. You start to, you know, even when you're by yourself and reading a poem aloud, you can sort of start to hear where some of the music or some of the syntax is hitching, as well. But it's also like, and I'm curious of what you two think about this. It's also been really interesting work, like reading from this new book, because I'm still like trying to navigate like what a reading is from this book, and trying to navigate like how what am I putting together, because there's so many directions that you can go in any given book of poems, that you know, to choose one given night, like I'm gonna take this route, or and there are so many poems that like I really love from the collection, but sometimes it's just like I probably won't get to read that one tonight, and that's, you know, and I just got to be okay with that. So that's also been interesting. I don't know if that's been the same for you too, with navigating new books in particular.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I've been reading these poems some before, so it's not completely new. But one other thing I do want to say in answer to you is, even though we all practice, even though we all read our poems aloud to ourselves, it's different having you all out there.
Mm,
And we wouldn't be the readers we are if we didn't have you folks to be our audience. You just can't read to your wall.
Which is certainly what made so much of the pandemic, I'm sure, like really challenging for
Yeah,
writers.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Like even if you have a lot of people in the space,
Yeah.
it's just a different,
It's different.
there's a different kind of energy that's in the room.
Yeah.
There's a different sort of responsiveness that you can gather from just like being in proximity with others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know that I really appreciated as much audience, like how much the audience and readers like complete poems for you.
Yeah.
Nothing like a library.
Yeah, yeah.
But those folks out there, we're grateful
All
for
right,
you.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We just
We love
glad-
you.
we're glad that there are supplements as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
I loved Zoom readings. I really did. I mean, live, there's nothing that can replace the live reading, but I really did
Yeah.
like Zoom readings. It was a good practice.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
um,
Oh, no.
they're not. I mean, now we're national. you
Well,
know,
that's right.
it's-
I mean, I love to be able to go to a reading in California when I'm
Yeah.
sitting in Cambridge. you
Right.
know? That's pretty nice.
Yeah, that was like and it's revolutionized, I think, the way that we do writing workshops and all sorts of other things, because you can get people from anywhere. And I think it's really reinvigorated some reading series too. Like I imagine, Jennifer, that like you're able to get, this space is only gonna be able to hold so many people, and so to be able to have, the rafters filled with others via Zoom, I think is wonderful. I know that there are other reading series who have really transitioned, I think, to those hybrid kinds of readings really well.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you all. People out there.
Out there, don't forget to buy these books. Order them online. And right here.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
buddy.
That was fantastic. That was just fun and fantastic. It was just, yeah,
really
wow.
I'm so glad to know your poems,
Thank you.
which I didn't. Nathan, I very, very rarely do this, but this was a Zoom reading, of
Right.
course, because what else, And I don't know if it was, I don't